Hi, Bob. Thank you so much for joining us today on View from the Owner Room.
Karen, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
You have been writing and thinking about a topic that I think will be really interesting to family businesses, which is your concept of conflict resilience. Can you explain to me what that means, what the concept of that means?
Absolutely. So, a lot of my work over the past 25 years has focused on conflict management, conflict resolution. And conflict resilience is both related, but also a little bit different. Related insofar as the idea is to help individuals and families and organizations and companies better manage and handle conflict. But the idea is really around how do we develop both individual and collective capacity to be in the face of differences, whether it's around how we should proceed as a business or how we should proceed as a country or even as a family, be in those differences, be able to express our viewpoint in an assertive and confident way, but also in a way that maximizes the chances that others who disagree with us can hear us, and also at the same time, actually be able to listen to and be curious about the viewpoint and perspective of others. And I guess this idea of conflict resilience is one that I have seen to be in decline, both at a societal level, but also really at an individual and family level, that people tend to either move into an avoidance mode or a passive aggressive mode until things maybe become completely unlivable. And then instead of taking it on with a degree of kind of skill and confidence, they kind of move to all-out war or battle.
Okay, that rings really true to me for life around us and in my own personal life. I'm just curious, why do you think we're at this place now where people are so either afraid of conflict or agitating for conflict that we can't hear each other and we feel safe expressing ourselves, meaning we're just in corners, in whatever our conflict is. Why do you think that's happening now?
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors that have contributed to this. So first thing I'll say is, right, I think conflict generally, right, has always been hard for people. So that is not new. I think a number of things have changed, especially around our willingness and ability to sit with that difference. I think one is just a social media environment that allows us to really create these cocoons of kind of comfort. I could easily cancel you. I create, whether it's on TikTok or YouTube or Facebook, right? A set of people who agree with me. And in an older day, right, our communities were pretty geographic. So we somehow had to figure out a way to make it work. But now, even in the context of a family, right, you think about a family sitting at dinner and everyone kind of has their phone. And it's like, if grandpa or Uncle Rocco are saying something I disagree with, I could just escape that and start, texting my friends about how ridiculous this person across the table is for me. I also think that there's just a general trend, I think, in our culture that we shouldn't have to feel uncomfortable. I think that discomfort is bad. I think also we're in this kind of moment, and I would say on all sides of the political fence, where engagement with those with whom we disagree is seen somehow as weakness or accommodation, or you're buying into the current power structure. And so it's seen as like not a positive good, right? So I think there's some cultural things. I think there's some technological contributions. I think there's some of the ways in which even our schools have, in an attempt, and in a good attempt, right, to make education in some ways safer and more welcoming, sometimes we have not done that as carefully as we could. And so we're not creating the containers and the spaces and the opportunities for really hard conversations.
I think that's a really interesting point. We become uncomfortable with being uncomfortable, and so we avoid it.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we all sort of seek others who agree with us to make us feel less uncomfortable with our point of view, right? So we build our own little a posse, people who agree with us. You talk, sitting across the table from your grandpa or your Uncle George or whatever. Not only have I seen people text other people, but I've seen people text other people at the table secretly, like you sort of secretly, like grandpa. So we kind of are looking for corners and sides and people to support us rather than having, whatever kind of conversation we might secretly or overtly want to have, but feel that we can't. We've lost that skill somehow.
Yeah. And I think, Karen, one of the things that I worry about, right? I think another reason is that sometimes people feel like it's hopeless. We're not going to find any common ground anyway. And this is tiring. So why bother? And I guess what I would say to that is, and this is, I think, an important piece of conflict resilience from my perspective, which is that even around issues where we are unlikely to find much common ground, there is a kind of leadership quality and personal capacity around conflict resilience that matters. Because even if you and I will never see eye to eye on issue A, B, and C, when I have a real engagement with you, even if we don't end our conversation with a bow, I learn more about you as a person. I can understand more of the narrative, the perspective that you're bringing. And what results, right, is that even if I'm going to continue to disagree, I can't see you as a unidimensional cartoon character anymore. And if you move away from being that unidimensional cartoon character into a full-fledged person with story and reasoning, it means there's other domains where we can probably actually work on some things. And so some of the work that I've done this in a lot of contexts, in businesses and families, but even like in international situations, I've worked with Israelis and Palestinians. And when you have young leaders talking around what both sides really experience as existential, they tend not to come away agreeing with the other side. They actually still see it pretty differently, but the way they describe the other people is very different. And that, I think, is really important, because if I don't see you as like a person with a story and a narrative and feelings that have some connection to my own, then it makes it really hard to do any problem solving, right? What we end up doing is either avoiding or escalating to the most costly way of handling conflict, which, at an international level is violence and war, and often in like a business situation is, litigation and lawsuits.
So let me repeat back what I think I just heard you say. So the idea of conflict resilience is us building the skills and competence and comfort in hearing something that's not necessarily comfortable to us to better understand the other person, even if we're not going to change our mind, and building the competence and skills and comfort in expressing what's important to us, even if we're not going to change the other person's mind, just as a way of getting comfortable with conflict sort of fleshing us out as human beings with different points of view who we need to communicate with, and going through that process and getting comfortable, building your resilience, your conflict resilience actually enables things to be better the next time or down the line in your relationship, because you are full human beings who have the right to express yourselves in that way. And it will benefit you if you actually work at doing this. Did I summarize that correctly?
That's brilliant. So good.
Okay, good.
No wonder why you're such a good editor.
Well, so I imagine that will be ring true to a lot of our families too, because conflict in families can feel existential. It's not Israel and Palestine, but it can feel existential about the family, right? Why are we in this together? Why do we have to be in this together? Why do I have to find a way to make decisions with you, even if I don't like them? Maybe I can take, my portion of the marbles and go home. So the stakes can feel that high for families as well. We talk about at Banyan, people getting into what we call a conflict spiral, that what starts off as a small or big conflict or disagreement kind of escalates in very predictable ways, all the way down to, calling the litigators. And at that point, things are lost. You're probably not going to be able to come back from it easily. Conflict resilience, I would assume, would help people avoid getting to that stage if they can, at any stage of that spiral, find a way to step back and figure out how to do what you're talking about, is listen and be heard at the same time, even knowing it might be uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, there's pretty big differences between Israel and Palestine and a family.
Not
But
always.
I think there's one really special way in which there's a real similarity, which is that you can't escape, right? They are geographically bounded and living right on top of each other. And in a family, unlike in a lot of business situations, we could kind of end our partnership. Politically, right? We can kind of find our own party. Friendship, we can end the friendship. But in a family, we're kind of still going to be family, right? We are intertwined in some ways that I think make the need for conflict resilience much higher. And I think I totally agree with you, Karen, that the better, more competent we are at, in those early stages, finding a way to talk about in a direct way, not in an avoidant way, the ways in which we are disagreeing, being able to kind of engage the other and build some skills of perspective taking, the higher the likelihood that we are going to avoid the kind of, what often starts out first as kind of passive aggressive behavior. And then I think later can come, almost like, conflict by proxy or, backstabbing, while there's all this kind of hope that somehow it'll just magically disappear or work itself out. And so part of it, I also think, and a piece of conflict resilience for me, is almost reframing how we think about conflict. Because we tend to think of conflict as necessarily bad, and
Right.
therefore it needs to get avoided. And I guess I don't think about it that way. I think conflict is around differences. And if you're going to bring, more than a single person into a room, you're almost certainly going to have some differences. And differences are usually sources of, or can be at least, sources of creativity, vibrance, dynamism, new ideas, innovation. And certainly in a family business, those are things that you want, right? So it's how do we reframe that we think about it, and then how do we find the ways to talk about it, and then what do we do with that, right? What do we do with the ways in which we actually can have some meaning in the mind, and how do we sit with the ways in which right now we don't?
So let's talk about that, because I can imagine completely agreeing with you that that's the right way to do it. And I still know which of my relatives push my buttons. I still know the times when I have not been my best self in conflict. My family argues over Christmas details, like whose house and what foods and who brings what, escalated up to serious, ownership discussions for family business. So walk me through an example of how do you start having that conflict or having the right conversations? How do you do it well? You just talked about the stages of accepting that this is important, and then how do you practice it? Give us an example, or what would I think about to get myself and everyone else in that conversation in the right space?
Yeah, it's sure, happy to do that. And so I think that this may or may not surprise you and others, but I think you have to start with you. So a question that I often would say, right, is, if someone is coming to me, right, for kind of coaching or help with this, and they haven't engaged it very much yet, right? They know that the Christmas fight, you know how it goes. You could predict the lines, but you haven't done anything about it. Yeah. But you spend some time thinking about it. And so thinking, I guess the invitation is, what are the fears that you have about addressing this dynamic head on? And actually list them out, right? They're substantial and they're real. And then also thinking about, well, okay, what are the costs of avoiding? Because I think people often don't think about that, but having them write that out, right? They're substantial and real. And I think that almost naming our ambivalence about engaging this is the place to start. And it's a place to frame actually a new conversation. There's a side of me that is worried about raising this with you, whatever, mom, or, my sister, because I don't want the relationship, to go be worse, or I'm afraid of my feelings getting hurt, or someone else's feelings get hurt. And at the same time, I really think that not raising it has resulted in some really high costs for me and maybe for others in our family. And that's why I'm wondering, is there something else we can do, and a different way we can talk about it, that neither of us know what it's going to look like, but it would be different? I mean, that's a short way of just thinking about.
No, it's a great way. It's a great way of, I literally was just thinking, again, my own situation, which is so small, but Christmas is so stressful in my family. There are back channel conversations to avoid. I come from a family of conflict avoiders. So we do all kinds of crazy mechanisms. I can imagine that even just going through the exercise of, what am I afraid? What are the issues that are here that I'm afraid of? And what are the consequences of avoiding it would be pretty powerful on a piece of paper, notes to myself only, of like, what, this should not be dealt this way. We should deal with it in a better way. That's interesting.
Yeah. And one of the things like I often think about is, there's not when you decide to do something new, we don't know how it's going to work out. I think one of the reasons why, especially, and I've definitely found this, particularly in family situations, right? It's like extremely painful, completely predictable, and exhausting. But people keep doing it because at least we kind of know how it turns out. It's bad, but we know how it turns out. When we do something different, that raises the possibility it does raise the possibility it will be worse. But it also raises the possibility it will be great or better. And at some sense, I think that's what people are hoping for. And even sometimes when the worst outcome happens, we end up then learning something new that helps us make a different set of choices. And so I think that for me, right, many times when I've worked like in a client context around a set of issues like this, sometimes there'll be a moment where I'm like, oh my gosh, am I possibly making this worse too? But then what I always think, and I always kind of check with the client, like, and remind them, like, we are trying something new because we've been trying the same thing, or you've been trying the same thing over and over and over and over again and getting the same result that you find deeply unsatisfactory, that keeps you up at night, that tends to have you do something, backstabbing, and then you feel bad about it. So I can't tell you this is going to work. What I can tell you is it is different.
Right. And a change of perspective may change the outcome.
Yeah.
So what might different look like, right? If in let's not use my family, use any family's having some kind of years old conflict that comes up, or they're avoiding something, or maybe they're even working their way down the conflict spiral. What kinds of things have you seen people employ to do different, to come in at it from a different perspective?
Yeah. So I think some of the kind of within the context of handling a set of hard issues, I think first, right, the one big difference is just the manner or way in which the conversation is conducted, meaning that there is like an invitation to a different conversation with an invitation to identify what are the actual issues and really kind of talk about them not from a what should we do perspective at first, but from what is important to us with respect to the issue and why. Right. And then why do we feel that way, right? Where there is kind of space given and expected that you are going to state those things, and that also others are willing to actually do some really good listening. So, okay, so what? Now we've done that, right? I mean, that's nice. I think the other piece of that, right, is that it often helps you feel like you've gotten something off of your chest. And I think it often helps name that even if there are not like shared views on the set of issues, that they're often like shared emotions.
Right.
And often those emotions aren't that great. But that is kind of interesting, right? Because even if we're like, okay, we feel angry, anxious, hurt, confused, and everyone else in the room does as well, then the question is, well, what do we need to do to change that?
Right.
Like, do we have collective will here or
Right.
desire to do that? And what do we need to do to change that? And usually, like, people will have some ideas on that, actually. Now sometimes if you have someone who's maybe not there, in a bad moment when they're not being skillful, or when they'll say something like, "Oh yeah, well the way we change it is you agree to everything I want to do."
Right.
Right. But oftentimes that's not what happens, and so there's a different way of handling it.
Is it possible for somebody, or maybe two people in a group who are represent two opposing points of view and maybe are most worked up about it or most entrenched in their point of view, can they lead that conversation, or do you need someone else? I'm not saying necessarily an outsider or neutral person, but is it a good tactic to have them express themselves and get it out and get that agreement on at least, what we value together or what emotions we're feeling? Or does it require somebody with a tiny bit more distance? I don't know. How do you navigate it when you have strong points of view?
Yeah. So I'll give you the typical lawyer's answer, right? Which is, it depends.
Okay.
But I would say, I think in many contexts, it can be helpful to have a third party, at least in the beginning, right? Certainly in the work that, I've had the opportunity to do, right? A lot of times, you're getting an assessment of people's skill levels, their own kind of self-awareness, their own willingness to make themselves vulnerable. And I do think often having someone who has a facilitative role, especially if the patterns have been toward avoidance. Because what can happen, even sometimes when parties come together with skill and desire to do this, right? There's still that moment when they hear something, like it's kind of going well, but they hear something and it kind of hits them. And they're like, well, I don't think I should bring it up. And that's the well-trod path, right? And I think someone who's kind of skillful in facilitating will be like, oh, let's take a step back. I noticed a reaction there and I wonder what was going on for you, right? So I think having a facilitator can be helpful. I also think, I've certainly seen and known of situations where with some good preparation and some good coaching, it might be advisable for the person to do it without a facilitator, right? That is, there is a way in which there could be a better degree of vulnerability that might happen that wouldn't happen with a third person there. So there's some judgment and discretion to be used.
So let me ask you about, I'm really interested in your concept of resilience. So it's two things. It's building up the ability to be resilient, to navigate these conflicts as we talked about, but also I assume it applies to, what if you've been in a cycle of recognized open or not conflict, and there's wound, there's damage in your family. Can you come back and from that, heal from that and continue to be able to have constructive conversations? How do you advise people to kind of get back and to being around the table together for whatever they need to, whether it's a holiday dinner or it's making major decisions? Where does the resilience come in?
Yeah, this is a really important question, Karen, right? Because I think in the work and writing that I'm doing, I really want to make a distinction between engaging areas where we feel discomfort and unpleasantness, and putting ourselves in situations where we're exposing ourselves to trauma again, right? I'm not a trained therapist. I'm not, and so I am not an expert in trauma. I think that is really important for individuals in a family situation or any situation, to do some assessment work. Whether is this a situation where actually, going back to the table, is truly a trauma, in which case I think that we need to think about other ways to handle the conflict. Or is this me being avoidant, or me wanting not to feel comfortable, uncomfortable? And I think if it's the latter, I mean, for me, the resilient idea is that part of being a successful human being in relationships, being a successful leader in organization, is being able to sit in and with that discomfort, right? To name it, to feel it, but also to say there are good and worthy reasons why it's important to engage this set of issues, right? And certainly I would hope and think that in a family context, we could find what they are, and so part of that also, I think, is around some of the self-audit work, and thinking about what are the set of interests that are not being met, that I think if we could somehow engage around these hard issues, there's a possibility that these interests could be met. And so I think there's some preparation work around that. And that actually, by the way, the most efficient and value creating way to that would be kind of through it and not around it. And the most sustainable way would be through it and not around it.
So I can see real value in even acknowledging that you need to build the skill of conflict resilience individually and within your family group or within your owner group. I understand the value of that. What top 3 tips would you give people to start thinking about building that skill?
Yeah. Okay. So number 1 would be to really reframe your own way you think about conflict in your life. So to try to see conflict as opportunity for innovation, growth, learning. 1. Number 2, I think, is, and I think this is something you can really practice, which is develop some skills of like effective assertion. So what does that look like practically speaking? So in a moment where you think there's a side of me that is feeling like I should engage this topic, and a side of me that feels like I shouldn't, for the moment, silence the one that says you shouldn't and engage the topic. And then third, and it's equally important, is just to develop some perspective taking skill, which for me just starts at really good listening. Now, I could say that in like a sentence, right? But listening is a hard skill to do, but active listening. So deepening like your own curiosity about others. Another way of thinking about it is like any of you have had like a 4-year-old, right? Channel the inner 4-year-old who keeps on saying, but why? But why? But why? Right? Not with that tone, but with that sense of kind of wonder and interest.
I think that's incredibly valuable advice, because I think we all get so ready to have the fight or avoid the fight that we're not even in that frame of mind at all to be thinking about what am I trying to hear here, listening here and understanding the other person. And I'm sure it takes multiple try. You don't do this in one day, but I think even coming in with that frame of reference that you just set out in those 3 points would be really, really valuable. Do you use this in your own life? Do you practice what you preach?
I try. I think I'm more, I always say, and people are nice. They don't really believe me, but I'm like, I'm not that good at this. They're like, oh, you must be good at this. I'm like, I don't think I am. I think I'm good at being diagnostic. And I think part of why I find this material so interesting is that I've had to break it down for myself to be able to do some of the micro moves and skills. But I guess in my good moments, I think I'm okay. And I'm definitely trying to be better. But I think I'm probably better being kind of diagnostic and coach than I am, on the court myself.
Thank you, Bob. That was really helpful, and actually given me personally a lot of food for thought on, I think, the importance of being resilient, conflict resilient, because I think it would be too easy to just try to avoid it or get really angry and let it fester. And I think this is a skill that too few people think about developing, and I think you've given us ways to think about developing it.
Well, thanks, Karen, and thanks for inviting me. This is something that's very close to my heart, so I'm glad to have shared it with your viewers and listeners.
Let me ask you one more question. You have a book coming out sometime in the future on this topic. When can we see your book? When will it be available to us?
Yeah, we are hoping, if things go well, the book will be out probably in mid-2024. So it's a little bit of a ways, but it's a book that I'm doing with a colleague who actually, his area of research is around neuroscience. So it's going to include a lot of the ideas that I talked about here, but also really bringing in the science of what is going on in our brain in those moments when we're feeling fight or flight, and how can we train our brain as well.
Excellent. Well, I will definitely be one of your buyers, and I look forward to the book coming out. Thank you for sharing some of your thoughts with us today.
Thank you.